The night Edmund Ashby turned 8 years old, he nearly did not survive it. That was the fact. His father, Viscount Harwick, never spoke aloud. Not at breakfast, not at dinner, not in the 3 years that followed. As the boy grew sturdy and loud and considerably more interested in horses than in his Latin primers, the Viscount was not a man who revisited what had frightened him. He set his jaw, which was a strong jaw, and he walked past the door of the old nursery with his gaze fixed at the end of the corridor. And he did not think about the night the fever broke. He did not think about who had broken it. Miss Celia Price had arrived at Harwick Park the February before. Edmund's illness, hired on recommendation of a solicitor's wife as a companion and governess to the late Lady Harwick's only son. The Viscount had conducted the interview in under 8 minutes. He had noted that she was 22 years old, the daughter of a Shropshire clergyman recently deceased, that she spoke French tolerably and Italian not at all, that her hands were ink-stained at the right forefinger, and that she did not flinch when he told her Edmund was difficult. He had offered her the position at a salary he considered fair, and that was, in fact, £3 below the standard for a household of Harwick Park standing. She had accepted without negotiation. He had not thought about her again until the night his son stopped breathing correctly. That had been the autumn of 1815, 3 years ago now. 3 years since he had stood in the corridor outside the nursery at 2:30 in the morning and heard her voice through the door, low and steady, reading aloud by candlelight, while Edmund's chest rattled and the physician shook his head. In that way, physicians had when they wished to prepare a parent without committing themselves to preparation. Colwick, his steward, had put a hand to his arm. The Viscount had removed it. He had not gone in. That was the truth. He did not speak about either. He did not know why. He told himself it was because he had faith in the physician. He told himself it was because he trusted Miss Price, which he did, empirically the way one trusted a well-made piece of furniture. He stood in the corridor for 4 hours, and he did not go in, and he did not leave. At 6 in the morning the fever broke and Edmund cried, which he had not done in the 2 days previous, and Miss Price's voice rose above the boy's weeping and said, quietly, firmly, "There. There, you are still here." The Viscount had walked back to his study. He had not thanked her. He had given her a bonus of £10 at Christmas, delivered through Cholwick in an envelope with no note, and he had told himself this was sufficient. She was his employee. Her competence was not something he was required to marvel at. It was something he had paid for, and paid for it he had. Edmund remembered none of this with any accuracy. What Edmund remembered was her hands on his forehead when the heat was worst, and the smell of the lavender water she had used, and the sound of her voice in the dark when he could not tell whether it was day or night, or whether he was still himself. He had told his father this once, he had said, "Miss Price saved me," with the cheerful certainty of a 9-year-old for whom the fact required no embellishment. The Viscount had looked at his son for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "She was doing her duty," he said, "as all of us must." Edmund had accepted this explanation, because he was 9 and his father's voice permitted no revision. He filed it alongside other, unquestionable facts that the sky was blue, that horses required grain, not only grass, and that his father did not embrace people. Not even him except on Christmas morning and the anniversary of his mother's death, those 2 days being apparently the sanctioned occasions for it. Miss Price herself had never spoken of that night. This was, Celia thought, the most correct thing she had ever done. She had understood from her first week at Harwick Park that the Viscount was a man who did not wish his debts made visible, even the ones that were not debts of money. He paid his accounts promptly and in full. He ran his household with a precision she had come to genuinely admire. He was stern with Edmund but not unkind, and when she had once, very carefully, suggested that the boy might benefit from a less abbreviated version of his Latin lessons, the Viscount had listened to her reasoning in silence, nodded once, and revised the schedule without comment or credit to the suggestion. She had not expected credit. She was a companion and governess. She expected a salary and a roof, and the daily work of keeping Edmund Ashby occupied and educated, and, on the harder days from falling out of the old oak near the stables, she had not expected to find, at 25, that she had become something she could not quite name inside the walls of a house that was not hers. It was not that she had grown attached to Edmund, though she had, in the way one grew attached to any small, loud, perpetually ink-stained thing one had spent 3 years keeping alive. It was something else. Something that lived in the hour before dinner, when she passed the Viscount in the corridor, and he stopped walking before she did, his eyes moving to her face with a directness that had no comfortable explanation, and then moved away again, without remark. Something in the morning room, on the Saturdays when Edmund's lessons were finished and the Viscount came to hear the week's progress, and he stayed 10 minutes longer than necessary, asking about the Latin, asking about the mathematics, asking with a specificity that suggested he had been thinking about the answers before he entered the room. She did not let herself think about what it might mean. She had thought about it on the evening of Edmund's birthday last October, standing at the nursery window watching the boy run circles around the stable yard below with the groom's youngest son, and she had caught herself cataloguing the length of that father's pause in the corridor on the anniversary of the night the fever broke. The way he had stood at the nursery door, which she had noticed only because she had been standing just inside it with a candle, checking Edmund's breathing one last time before her own sleep. She had seen his shadow under the door. She had not opened it. She had told herself this was discretion. She had told herself this was the correct behavior of an employee in a house where she was employed. She had blown out the candle and gone to bed, and lain there for an hour, listening to the sound of the house until she heard the Viscount's study door close below, which meant he had returned there, which meant he had been standing in the corridor for very nearly as long as she had been standing inside the nursery. She had not let herself think about what that meant either. The crisis came in November of 1818, on the occasion of a dinner the Viscount gave for his sister and her husband, Sir Philip Roe, who had arrived from Bath for a fortnight's stay with their 2 daughters, Georgiana and Miss Annabella Roe, the latter of whom was 19, very fair, and possessed of a £3,000 fortune which her mother had arranged to be mentioned within the first half-hour of arrival. Celia attended dinner the first evening in her capacity as companion to the household, seated below Lady Roe and above the steward's wife, which was exactly where she belonged. She wore her grey silk, which was the best she owned, and was 3 seasons old, and still respectable if one did not look too closely at the recut of the bodice. She sat quietly and ate her soup, and listened to Lady Roe explain to her brother, across the length of the table, that Annabella had been much admired in Bath, that Colonel Fenwick had danced with her twice at the lower rooms, and that the Hartley family had expressed interest, though of course she would not commit Annabella to anything until matters were properly settled. "She is a lovely girl," Lady Roe said. "I think you will find her agreeable." Adrian the Viscount said nothing. Lady Roe's gaze moved, with a precision that was not accidental to Celia. One must manage these matters carefully, of course. There are so many women in reduced circumstances these days who find their way into households and become, shall we say, installed? The table heard it. Celia set down her spoon. "Installed," Lady Roe repeated, her voice warm and her meaning ice-clear, "where they have no lasting right to be." Celia looked at her plate. She did not look at the Viscount. She did not look at Annabella, who was looking at her own plate with the expression of a girl who had been taught that her mother's sharpness was a form of love. She ate her soup, and she breathed, and she told herself that this was the cost of sitting at tables where one was not entirely welcome. She had sat at worse. What she did not see, because she was looking at her plate, was the Viscount's hand, the way his fingers went quite still on the stem of his wine-glass, and then set it down very carefully, and then did not move. Edmund was put to bed that evening by the under-nursemaid, as he was now 11 and perfectly capable of directing his own preparations, but still required supervision on account of the incident last spring with the window latch. Celia sat with him for half an hour and listened to his summary of the day, which included a lengthy critique of his Aunt Rose's hat and a detailed account of what he and the groom's son had constructed in the hayloft, which she made a note not to inspect too closely. "Will Papa marry Miss Annabella?" Edmund asked as she extinguished the second candle. "That is not my place to know," she said. "She has very little to say. She is young and in an unfamiliar house. One ought not judge a person's character in the first evening." "You had a great deal to say in the first evening," Edmund said. "I had 6 weeks of unpaid lodgings and an expired letter of introduction, and I required the position," Celia said, which was the most honest thing she had said to him in 11 months, and she regretted it immediately. "Go to sleep, Edmund." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the particular voice he used when he was trying to sound casual about something he had been thinking about for some time, he said, "She would not have sat with me all night. With the fever. She has the look of someone who sleeps regular hours." Celia did not answer this. "Miss Price," he said. "Edmund, you did not leave. Not once. In 3 days I was not asleep the entire time. I remember more than Father thinks I do." She stood at the door with her hand on the frame, and she said, "Sleep well," and she closed the door behind her, and stood in the corridor for a moment with her eyes shut. She had not left. That was true. She had sat in the chair by his bed, and read to him and changed the compresses and watched the physician come and go, and watched the Viscount's shadow under the door. And she had stayed, because he was a child and he was frightened and she was the person who was there. She had not done it. To be remembered, she had done it, because she had no way of not doing it. The fortnight of Lady Rowe's visit arranged itself as such fortnights do, into a particular shape. There were morning calls. There were carriage rides to the park in the pale November light, the bare trees lining the avenue that led to the house, the stone chimneys visible above the ridge when one came from the north road. There were evenings in the drawing-room at Hawick Park where Annabella played the pianoforte well, with the careful precision of extensive instruction, and very little natural feeling, and Lady Rowe watched her brother's face with a proprietary attention that made Celia's own face ache with the effort of looking elsewhere. The Viscount was civil to his niece. He was civil by the measures of civility that governed him to everyone. He asked Annabella about Bath, and she answered with a pleasantness that was genuine, and a depth that was not her fault. He listened to her play, and did not leave the room before the second piece, which Lady Rowe observed with evident satisfaction. What he did, which Lady Rowe did not observe because she was not watching him in the right moments, was continue to stop in the corridor outside the morning room when Celia's lessons with Edmund ran past the hour, and wait, not touching the door, not speaking, simply standing there as though he had paused to think of something and had not yet finished thinking, until either the lessons concluded or Edmund's voice carried through the paneling and broke whatever the pause was. He also, on the Thursday of the second week, found her at the library shelves shortly after 7 in the morning. He had not known she would be there. She could tell he had not known, because he stopped in the doorway with an expression that was not quite surprise, and not quite anything she had a name for, and his hand went to the frame of the door. She was taking down a volume of natural history that Edmund had requested. She was in her working dress, a plain dark blue with a white collar that she had mended twice at the cuff, and her hair was not yet properly pinned, only wound and fastened at the back, and she was very aware of this. "I did not know you kept these hours, Miss Price," he said. "Edmund has developed an interest in the Geological Survey volumes," she said. "I did not wish to disrupt your evening by requesting one." "It would not have disrupted me." She turned the volume in her hands. The spine was faded green, the lettering worn. "I shall have it back by noon," she said. He did not move from the doorway. The fire behind her was low, not yet stoked for the day, and the room was cold enough that she could feel it at her wrists where the cuffs had worn through. The light was thin and gray through the long windows, and it fell across the shelves and across his face, and she thought, in the particular unreasonable way she had trained herself not to think, that he was looking at her with the same concentration he applied to ledgers, as though she were something he was trying to make consistent with itself. "You are cold," he said. "I am perfectly well. Your cuffs are thin." "My lord," she said, and her voice was level, "I am adequately dressed for November mornings, and have been for some years." You should have told Mrs. Cholwick if you required additional wool. I did not require additional wool. He was quiet. Then he said Celia, and stopped. She looked at him. She had never heard him use her given name. She was not certain she had heard it used in some time, not since her father's funeral, not since anyone had known her well enough and cared enough to say it. It sat in the cold library air between them like something that had been placed there very carefully and was waiting to see if it would be disturbed. He appeared to realize what he had said. His jaw tightened. Miss Price, he corrected himself, precise and quiet. Forgive me. She turned back to the shelf. Her heart was doing something she chose not to examine. There is nothing to forgive, my lord. He left. She stood at the shelves with the geological volume pressed to her chest and the cold at her wrists, and the sound of the word where it had been. The morning of the following Monday brought a letter from Lady Rose's solicitor, and a subsequent conversation behind the closed door of the Viscount's study, the audible portions of which reached the hallway as the elevated register of Lady Rose's satisfaction and the lower, uninflected syllables of her brother's responses. Cholwick passed Celia on the stairs with an expression of studied neutrality that told her as much as any spoken sentence. She did not ask. Edmund asked. At the lunch table, why his aunt looked as though she had won at cards, and Lady Rose said, in her particular way of addressing the boy's questions, because some matters are approaching a very satisfying conclusion. Annabella looked at her plate. Celia looked at the window. That afternoon she sat in the morning room and corrected Edmund's Latin translation with a steadiness she was moderately proud of, making her marks in the margins with a clean hand. And she thought about the solicitor's letter and the closed door and the satisfying conclusion, and she thought about the word in the library that morning, the given name, the one moment of slippage, and she set her pen down and looked at Edmund's translation and told herself very firmly what was true. She was a clergyman's daughter. She was employed. She was 25 years old, which was 3 years past the age at which the season would have found her interesting, even if she had been the sort of woman the season found interesting, which she was not. She had £62 and some shillings to her name, and a reference from the Harwick household which was, by any practical measure, the most valuable thing she possessed. She would use that reference when Lady Rose's visit produced its satisfying conclusion, and a new Viscountess arrived who preferred to bring her own companions, and she would find another position, and she would perform it with the same care she had given this one. And she would not allow herself to be the sort of woman who confused professional kindness for something it had not been offered as. She picked up her pen. She corrected Edmund's translation of Cicero's third letter, which was a mess. And she thought that was that, and she told herself she believed it, and she almost did. What she did not account for was Edmund himself. She did not account for the fact that Edmund was 11 years old, and had been thinking, in his methodical and quietly remorseless way, about the night of the fever for 3 years. She did not account for the fact that he had been watching his father in the morning room doorways and the corridor pauses and the library early hour in the way that children watch adults, which is to say with an accuracy that has no pity in it and no confusion either. She did not account for the fact that on the Monday evening after dinner, Edmund excused himself from the drawing room and found his father in the study, and said, in the voice he used when he had decided something, "I would like to ask you something, father." The Viscount looked up from the estate accounts. Edmund, Lady Rose says matters are approaching a satisfying conclusion, Edmund said. I would like to know what matters. You will be informed of any decision that concerns you. It concerns me, Edmund, the Viscount said. This is not your province. Miss Price nursed me for 3 days when I was going to die. Edmund said. You stood outside the door. I know you did because I could see your shadow under it, through the gap. I think you were there for most of the night. The study was very quiet. She did not leave. Edmund said, You did not come in. I have been thinking about this for a long time, father, and I think you were afraid, and I understand that, because I was afraid too. I think she knew that. I think she stayed, because she understood that you could not. The Viscount set down his pen. I would not like, Edmund said, for her to go. There was a silence that lasted for some seconds. And then the Viscount said, very quietly, "Go to bed, Edmund, sir." Now Edmund went. He went, and he lay in his bed, and he listened to the house the way he had learned to listen to it, and after 20 minutes, he heard the study door open, and after a further 10 minutes, he heard footsteps in the corridor toward the morning room. And after that, he heard a murmured exchange through 2 doors and a wall that he could not parse but which lasted considerably longer than 10 minutes. And then he heard a single door close, and then nothing. He went to sleep. Celia had been sitting with her mending when the knock came at the morning room door. She had made herself sit with her mending. She had made herself sit in the room that was warm rather than her own small room at the end of the east wing, which was cold, and where she would have been entirely alone with her own thoughts, which she had decided were not safe company that evening. She had her needle in the collar of Edmund's second-best shirt, and the candle close, and she was not thinking about solicitors. "Come in," she said. The Viscount entered. He was still in his evening clothes, and his cravat was very slightly less precise than it had been at dinner, which she noticed only because she noticed everything about him, which was a fact she had stopped contesting sometime in the last 12 months. He closed the door behind him. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her with that concentration, and said nothing for long enough that she set down the mending. "My lord," she said, "is something wrong with Edmund?" "Edmund is well. Then what has brought you at this hour?" It was not quite a question. She heard it leave her mouth and knew it was not the question of an employee, and she did not take it back. "I came," he said, "to tell you something." "Shall I sit?" she said. "Or shall you?" Something moved in his face. Not quite the thing that was almost amusement, but close to it. He sat in the chair across the small table, which put him near enough that she could see the line of his jaw and the careful way he had composed his hands on his knees. The deliberateness of a man who does not trust his hands to be unstill on their own. "I have been conducting myself badly," he said. She waited. "I have told myself that what I paid for in this house I need not additionally acknowledge. I have told myself that correct remuneration was the sufficient expression of regard. I have told myself a number of things about the proper relationship between an employer and the persons in his employ." He paused. "I have been wrong in most of them, my lord," she said carefully. "You sat with my son for 3 nights and 3 days. When I could not bring myself to enter the room," he said. "I have not thanked you. I gave you £10 at Christmas, and I told Tralwick to deliver it. And I told myself the matter was addressed." His voice did not change in pitch. "It was not addressed. It has not been addressed in 3 years, and I have known this." She said nothing. The candle between them moved in some small current of air from the window. "You told him he was still here," the Viscount said. "I heard it from the corridor. I heard your voice, and then I heard him cry, and I heard you say those words, and I walked back to my study, and I have thought about those words approximately once every 2 weeks since November of 1815. Her hands were very still in her lap. "I came tonight," he said, "to ask you a question that I am not entitled to ask you. And I ask it with the understanding that your refusal would be entirely just and would in no way affect your position in this household." "Ask it," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. "I have been for some time," he said, "in a state of considerable feeling that I have managed very badly. I am not skilled at this. I am aware that I am not skilled at it. I am asking, Miss Price, whether you would be willing to permit me to manage it less badly, beginning with remaining in this room for longer than the duration of a business exchange." The candlelight was warm, and the fire behind him was low, and he was looking at her with an attention that had no politeness in it, only the honest discomfort of a man who has decided something and is not certain the decision will be received. She thought about £62 and a reference, and a room at the end of the east wing. She thought about the shadow under the nursery door, and the geological survey, and the given name in the library, and the word in the air. "I would permit that," she said. "Yes." He did not move for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you," with a quietness that was not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something more like relief. The particular relief of a man who has held the thing braced for a long time, and has been told he may set it down. They sat in the morning room for an hour and a half, and they talked about Edmund's Latin and the condition of the East Wing in winter, and a book she had been reading on the medicinal properties of common plants, and it was the least eventful conversation she had ever had, and she was entirely absorbed by it. It was not until she was preparing to leave, standing at the door with the mending under her arm, that he said, "Celia." She stopped. He was standing behind her. "I would like," he said carefully, "to ask Mrs. Colwick to move you to the south rooms. They are warmer. The cuffs of your working dress are worn through, and November in this house is not mild." She turned. He was near enough that she could see the small tension in his face, the carefulness of the request. "That would be very kind," she said. The weeks that followed had a quality she had no period vocabulary for, and therefore did not try to name. He came to the morning room. He stayed. He asked her, not Colwick, not Edmund's tutor, not Lady Rowe, who was still in residence, and observing these developments with a face that had moved from satisfaction to calculation, to something unreadable, what she thought about various matters of the household. About Edmund's education, about the condition of the library catalogue, which was poor, about whether the East Meadow would drain properly in spring if the ditch were extended. She answered him. She answered him honestly, which was the only way she knew how to answer. Lady Rowe intercepted her in the upstairs corridor on the Thursday of the following week, and said, in the pleasant voice of a woman who has sharpened her pleasantness over many years, "You are a resourceful creature, Miss Price. One must admire it, I suppose, in a woman of your situation. To have made yourself so very useful," Celia said. "I hope I have been of some service to the household, Lady Rowe." "You are modest." Lady Rowe's fan moved. "Though I suppose resourcefulness and modesty are tools, like any other, when one has nothing else to offer." Celia met her eyes. "I have nothing to offer," she said. "That is entirely correct." Lady Rowe smiled and walked away. And Celia stood in the corridor and waited until the sound of her slippers had retreated entirely before she moved. It was Colwick's wife, Mrs. Colwick, who told Celia the following morning that Lady Rowe had gone to the Viscount after dinner the previous evening, and had offered her reading of recent events in terms that were not. Mrs. Colwick said, choosing her words with an apologetic precision favorable to Miss Price, that Lady Rowe had used the word installed again, and the phrase, "a woman of that class," and had expressed concern about Annabella's prospects and the reputation of the household. "And, my lord," Celia said. Mrs. Colwick looked at her hands. "Thank you," Celia said. "That is sufficient. Allard." She taught Edmund his Latin that morning with a composure that cost her something she felt as a tightness behind the eyes. And she corrected his translation of Cicero's 7th letter, and she said nothing about what she had heard. She said nothing at lunch. She said nothing when she encountered the Viscount in the library, where he had gone after his midday meeting with Colwick, and he said, "Miss Price," and she said, "My lord," and she took down the volume she had come for and left, and she felt him watching her go, but she did not look back. She did not go to the morning room that evening. She went to her room at the south end of the corridor, which was warm, which was better than the east wing had been, and she sat at her writing table and looked at the paper she had drawn out to write a letter that she had not yet decided whether to send. The letter was addressed to the wife of a clergyman in Worcestershire who had on 2 occasions now intimated that she was looking for a companion of good character and quiet disposition. She sat with the paper and the pen and the candle, and she thought about what quiet disposition meant, and whether she still possessed it, and whether she had lost it in a morning room in November over the course of 17 months, and whether losing it was something she was going to grieve, or something she was going to put away the way one put away a dress that no longer fit. Not with sentiment, simply with the acknowledgement that the body that had worn it was gone. She did not write the letter. She went to bed. The dinner Lady Rowe had arranged for the following Saturday was the occasion she had clearly been building towards since the arrival of the solicitor's letter. 12 guests, including the neighboring magistrate, 2 families from the adjacent estates, and the vicar and his wife, who were the closest thing Harwick Park had to a village committee of social certification. Annabella was in pale gold. Lady Rowe was in dark amber with diamonds. Celia wore her grey silk again and sat between the vicar's wife and the younger son of the neighboring estate, who was 18, and enthusiastic about hunting, and not much else. The Viscount sat at the head of the table. Lady Rowe sat at his right hand, and arranged the evening from that position with the practiced ease of a woman who had been arranging evenings for 20 years. Annabella played after dinner while the assembled guests arranged themselves in the drawing-room, and the vicar's wife complimented her execution, and Lady Rowe said in the carrying tone she had perfected, "We hope the arrangement will be quite settled before Christmas. Adrian has been too long without the proper guidance of a mistress in this house." The magistrate's wife said, "Indeed, a settled household is so much better for the children," and looked at Celia. Celia looked at her hands. She was very aware of the precise weight of her grey dress, the worn cuffs which she had managed to turn at the last possible point, the borrowed silk of the sash which was not borrowed precisely, but had been her mother's, and was 20 years old and still held its color. She was aware of exactly how she appeared from the outside of this room, and she was also aware that she was not going to cry, because she had decided this some years ago as a matter of policy, and she had not revised the decision. She heard the Viscount stand. She did not look up immediately, because she had learned not to map herself to the sound of his movement in a room, which was a habit she was dismantling. When she did look up, he was standing behind Lady Rowe's chair, not at her, but facing the room, and the room had gone into the particular silence of people who have understood something is about to happen. "I should like," he said, in the level voice that would carry to every corner without effort, "to take this opportunity, as the company is gathered, to announce an intention I have been some time informing." Lady Rowe's hand moved on the table. "Just slightly. I have asked Miss Price," the Viscount said, "to do me the honor of becoming my wife." The silence held. "She has consented," he said. "Now, I thought it proper that this company should know it." "Lady Rowe," said Adrian in a tone that had lost its pleasant edge. He looked at her. "Augusta," he said, "Annabella has had a thoroughly pleasant fortnight at Harwick Park, and I trust she will be warmly received wherever she goes next. You have my assurance that her prospects are in no way diminished by any decision I have made." "You cannot have considered," Lady Rowe began. "I have considered for 3 years," the Viscount said. "I have been somewhat slow. I am aware of it." Celia was standing. She did not remember standing. The vicar's wife was looking at her with an expression that was moving, by visible stages, from surprise to something more considered. The expression of a woman who is revising a prior assessment. The magistrate's wife had gone very still. Annabella, who was still at the pianoforte, had turned on the bench, and her face was not what Celia expected, which was not wounded, but was instead something that looked in the candlelight almost like relief. She looked at the Viscount. He was looking at her. The room was between them, and the candles were burning, and his face had the expression she had never found a name for, the one she had seen in the library and in the corridor, and in the morning room at 11 in the evening, except that now it was in front of 12 people, and there was no diplomatic retreat available, and he was not retreating. "Celia," he said. She felt it land the same way it had landed the first time, in the library, in the cold morning. "Come here." She crossed the room. She was aware of every pair of eyes. She was aware of her grey dress, and her 25 years, and her 62 pounds, and the solicitor's letter, and Lady Rowe's amber diamonds. She was aware of all of it, and she crossed the room anyway, because she had made herself a policy of not crying, and she had not made herself a policy of not walking toward the things she wanted, and she had not realized this until this moment. She stood before him. He took her hand, not gloved, because she had left her gloves on the chair beside the vicar's wife, and the warmth of his grip was a specific physical fact that she registered the length of her arm. "Thank you," he said quietly. And it was the same word he had used in the morning room, the one that meant relief. The The one that meant the thing held braced for a long time and now set down. "You are still here," she said. He looked at her. She saw him understand it, saw him recognize the words, and know where they came from and what they were carrying. Something in his face shifted in a way she had never seen it shift, not quite undone but not sealed either. Lady Rowe rose from the table and said, "We shall speak of this tomorrow, with the frost of a woman who has not surrendered but who knows the field." The vicar's wife said quietly to her husband, "I always thought there was something rather steadfast about Miss Price." There was not very much more to say after that. The guests arranged themselves, and the conversation reformed, as it always did around the social fact already rendered, and Annabella played one more piece with the clean, careful precision of a girl who was going to be absolutely fine, and Lady Rowe sat with her fan and said nothing further, which was not forgiveness but was the correct behavior of a woman who understood when a scene was concluded. The conversation Lady Rowe and her brother had the following morning lasted 45 minutes and was conducted entirely behind a closed door. Celia was in the morning room with Edmund, who had been told of the evening's events by Mrs. Dallor, Colwick's eldest daughter, at breakfast, and was sitting with his Latin translation with the expression of a person who is maintaining academic focus as a matter of pride rather than interest. "Is it settled?" he said. "That is for your father to tell you. He will tell me in the correct order," Edmund said. "He tells things in the correct order. I am asking you because you were there." She looked at him across the table. He was 11 years old, and he had her eyes, which was not something she had let herself think in quite those terms before, but which was simply what she saw. A boy with large brown eyes who had decided 3 years ago with the certainty of a child in the dark that she was worth remembering. "Yes," she said, "it is settled." Edmund nodded. He looked down at Cicero. He translated 2 lines. Then he said without looking up, "I said he was afraid." "In the study, I thought he might be angry, was he?" "No," Edmund said. "He was quiet. He was quiet for quite a long time, and then he told me to go to bed." A pause. "He came in to say good night an hour later. He has not done that since I was very small." She set down her pen. "He said," Edmund added, returning his attention to Cicero with the focus of a boy who has delivered what he came to deliver, "that he had been poorly organized about certain things. I told him that this was not his usual practice. He said no, it was not, and that he intended to address it." She picked up her pen again. She looked at the window. November light, pale and thin, the bare limes along the south walk standing in their rows. She thought about the fever and the dark, and the shadow under the door, and the 3 years of corridors and mornings, and the word said, and then corrected and said again in front of 12 people. And she thought that it was possible to do something because it was simply the right thing to do, and for the remembering to do its work slowly, the way stone shapes under water, until the morning you looked up and found yourself shaped entirely differently from how you had been. She corrected Edmund's translation. He had the verb forms wrong, all of them, which was not unusual. They worked for another hour. That evening, when Lady Rowe and Sir Philip and both daughters had finally departed in their carriage south, and the house had settled into its usual sounds, the particular creak of the upper stairs and the low sound of the fire in the east sitting room, Celia sat beside that fire with a book she was not reading and a cup of tea that had gone cold. The Viscount came in. He sat down across from her, which was the chair he had taken in the morning room 3 weeks ago. And he looked at the fire, and she looked at the fire, and the house was quiet around them. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and brought out a small oval shape in a worn ivory frame, a miniature oil painting of a woman she did not know, dark-haired, with Edmund's eyes, or Edmund with her eyes, rendered by some careful hand in the previous decade. He held it for a moment, and then set it on the small table between them. "Edmund's mother," he said. She looked at the small oval face. "She was lovely. She was generous," he said. "She would have been kinder to you than I have been." She thought about this. "You were not unkind," she said. "I was insufficient," he said, "which is its own variety of unkind. She considered the fire. "You came to stand outside the door," she said. "For 4 hours in the dark when you did not know what was going to happen. I am not sure that was insufficient." He was quiet for a long moment. "I did not come in." "No," she agreed. "You did not." "And I did not open it." She paused. "We were both learning, I think, what we were capable of. We had not yet arrived at the rest." He looked at her. The firelight was warm, and the rest of the house was still. There was the small ivory frame between them on the table. The woman with Edmund's eyes. "We have arrived now," he said. "We have arrived now," she said. She picked up her book, and he picked up the estate accounts that Cholwick had left on the side table, and the fire burned, and the house settled around them into the quiet of a place that has become, without announcement, a home. Edmund, who had been reading at the top of the stairs where the acoustics of the upper hall meant he could hear the drawing room without being visible, went to bed with the satisfaction of a boy who has done what he set out to do and sees no need to discuss it further. He slept well that night. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning, very light, on the bare limes along the south walk. By morning, it would be gone, melted by the thin December sun before the household stirred. Celia did not see it fall. She was still in the sitting room when it began, and the fire was still burning, and neither of them had looked at the clock. If this story has found its way to you on an evening when you needed it, stay a while longer. Share it with someone who knows what it is to wait outside a door. She was here all along, and so was he.